Welcome, Adam Bandt, Leader of the Greens. Thank you so much for coming in to talk to the full story. And we also have our political reporter, Josh Butler, with us in Canberra.
Yeah,
Hi,
welcome,
Reged.
Adam.
Hi, Josh. Thanks for having me in.
Okay, we're going to want to get started by talking to you about the possibility of minority government. It's something you've been talking about. We've heard a lot of it in the media. And you've been setting out some of your demands with the Labor government if they're returned to power in the form of minority government. And I want to start by asking you, given Anthony Albanese will be at the helm of that Labor government, what's it like to work with him?
I think there's a good working relationship, but obviously some pretty strong differences of policy on a number of areas.
Is there tension?
Well, I think it's forthright. Like, they want to open up more coal and gas mines. We don't. They still want to leave big corporations paying no tax. We want to tax them. And I think there's some pretty frank discussions about those areas and understand that there's areas of difference. I think that there's potential to get somewhere in the next minority parliament, get some action on some of those things. We know we're going to have to push Labor to do it. We're going to have to keep Dutton out if we're to get action on those areas. But look, that's part of the job, really. I mean, they're defending a certain position. They take money from the coal and gas corporations. They're going to defend. They're going to keep wanting to expand coal and gas. We understand that. We're there to fight to take real climate action, for example. They're going to be robust discussions, of course they are, but
Are they civil?
that's why we're there.
Is there a civil relationship
Yes, yeah, there is.
When was the last time you spoke to the Prime Minister?
Before the election was called, I can't remember exactly, but I mean, again, during the final weeks of Parliament last year, for example, we managed to, in discussions with Greens pressure, get an extra $500 million to go for retrofits for public and community housing, for example. And that came out of some discussions and pressure and negotiations that we had during that final week of Parliament. And as a result, some legislation got passed, and now public and community housing tenants are going to get things like solar panels.
So you would, what I'm trying to get at is you would characterise your working relationship as good, professional?
Yes, I think all of those things. And
rocky?
I think those, I think the professional and civil, but we make it's clear that there are areas that we disagree on, but there are also areas where we can find room to pass legislation. And I think that's what's happened in this Parliament. Like, you look back over this Parliament and you've seen the Greens pressure. It's been able to get an extra $3.5 billion for public and community housing. We've got the right to disconnect in the industrial relations laws. We've got extra protections that ensure more water is flowing into the Murray. Look, obviously there's some areas that we're going to continue to disagree on, and Labor prefers to work with the coalition on other areas.
Adam, you've been in the balance of power. The Greens have been in the balance of power in the Senate this term. Last election, you talked about this theme of kick the Liberals out, push Labor to go further. Do you think the Greens lived up to that promise, the promises you made about how you'd act and agitate in this term of Parliament?
Yes, I do. As said, we managed to, for example, when it came to the climate legislation, we managed to get a hard cap on pollution so that emissions can't just be continually offset, as Labor wanted to do, but are going to be required to start coming down, and not as fast as we would like. And yes, we would have liked to have got more, but we managed to push them further on the climate legislation. On housing, I think it's unchallengeable that because of the Greens, there's now a national discussion about renters and what the federal government can do to support renters. And we've got $3.5 billion extra for public and community housing, and 6 times as much money is going out the door now than Labor was intending to spend originally. And I think that's a really significant thing that we've done. Of course, when Labor chooses to go and work with Peter Dutton and the coalition, then that's a matter for the government, and we've seen them do that on environment laws. We saw them do that on things like mandatory minimum sentencing. But when Labor is prepared to work with the Greens, we've been able to get some good things done for people.
I mean, the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, Labor and the coalition, I'm sure you know, as you know, they have broadly called your agenda extreme. We heard Albanese say, this is a quote, "They don't talk about the environment anymore, they talk about some extreme agenda." So on that point, do you really think it's possible to work with Labor in a minority government if that's how they feel towards the Greens?
Well, what's extreme about wanting to get dental into Medicare? what's extreme about in this wealthy country of ours wanting everyone to be able to have a roof over their head?
So why do you think they're saying that about you?
Well, I think they've obviously got their talking points that they want to use to try and lift their vote up to the point where at the moment they can't even convince 1 in 3 people in the country to vote for them in the last election. You know, that's a pretty astounding position for a government to be in, but it's reflective of where Australia's at the moment. Like less than 1 in 3 people vote for the government, bit more than 1 in 3 vote for the opposition, and about 1 in 3 is voting for someone else, including the Greens. Now, I think I understand that they're going to have their talking points, but I think there is a very strong desire from the public being expressed in parliaments now that there be more voices at the table. And I think that then puts an obligation on people who are there to then work together to see if we can get some outcomes. Yes, there's going to be pushing, and pushing isn't always pretty. Pushing isn't always pretty. I accept that. We're up against some pretty powerful interests. The coal and gas corporations in this country are not going to give up their privileged position and the stranglehold they have on Labor and Liberal without a fight. They're not. And we've got a government that is made up of 75% of people with investment properties, and we've got Labor and Coalition giving massive handouts to wealthy property investors, and we're there fighting for the third of the country that rents, that's never had a voice before. We understand that we're up against some powerful interests, and so yes, we're going to push hard. But in this parliament that is more diverse, then the flip side of that is at a certain point, after pushing, people have to realise that no one's got a majority in this parliament. We certainly don't have a majority in the Senate. No one has a majority in the Senate at the moment, and that's been that way for a while, and it's very likely it's going to be that way in the lower house as well. And so that puts an obligation on us to then also work together.
Adam, the Conservative lobby group Advance, I'm sure you've seen some of their ads about the Greens and about Labor, and they've been targeting your party very heavily for some time. They've been sharing this extreme Greens tagline. They've been focusing on internal scandals in the party with their advertising. What do you think of them?
Well, it's a bit of a badge of honour when you've got billionaires and the Conservative forces lined up. They understand that the Greens are the real alternative. They know that they can get Labor and Liberal to keep it so that 1 in 3 big corporations pays no tax, keep it so that you can keep opening coal and gas mines, even as it cooks the planet. Whereas we're going in there saying we want big corporations to pay tax, we want billionaires to pay tax, we want to stop opening new coal and gas projects. And so the fact that they're deciding to spend millions of dollars coming after the Greens is a recognition of the fact that we're actually offering something that is an alternative agenda to theirs, and they feel that they can keep Labor and Liberal in their pockets and under their thumbs and not us.
You gave an interesting quote a second ago. You said pushing's not pretty. To follow that up, I mean, Labor still does have some real bitterness about the way that the Greens and you negotiated in this term of Parliament, especially around the housing bills. I'm not sure if you saw these comments yesterday, but Ed Husic, the industry minister on the ABC, he said, I'm quoting, this is in relation to the negative gearing. Ed Husic said, quote, "I'm not necessarily rushing to embrace an idea that Adam Bandt has. When we needed him and he could have helped, we could have got things moving quicker. He wasn't really there." I'm interested in what you do next. Do you go about trying to mend that relationship, or are you kind of a bit unconcerned that Labor is unhappy because you've gotten some of the things that you wanted in this term? I
think it's talking points, because I think you look at the legislation that was passed during this parliament, including their housing legislation, look at the climate legislation we negotiated, Ed Husic's own industry legislation that was passed because of the Greens in the Senate. And yes, along the way, we pushed and we secured some protections against public money going into coal and gas, for example. We secured more money for public housing than the government was ever prepared to put on the table. Now, I think that you've got to remember the government's housing policy that they took to the last election. This was when Anthony Albanese was trying to be a small target and crafted the most minimalist housing policy that was just a band-aid, tinkering around the edges, and we pushed them to do more because the housing crisis is real. And one of the things that I don't think that Labor or Liberal get is that a third of the country now rents. And so this, and because of their failure to do some of the things that we push them to do, rents have gone up 35% under this government, and house prices are even further out of reach for many first home buyers. I just don't think they get how serious the housing and rental crisis is, and we've pushed them to do more than the small target band-aid approach that they took to the last election. And I think that's when you are in the middle of a crisis, when you have these soaring rents, you have these soaring house prices that are pushing first-home buyers to the brink. I think the public wants Parliament and governments to act on that. And we've been trying to get Labor to act. You have to ask Labor why they refused to wind back tax handouts for people who've got 6 properties. You have to ask them why they wanted unlimited rent rises, but we think they're the right things to push for.
I'm kind of interested in this point you've made, that we're asking you about Labor's reaction to the Greens' approach, and you're saying they're talking points, right? So you're almost suggesting that what we see behind the scenes, that it's you and Labor having a decent relationship, but they kind of publicly get really upset at the Greens in terms of how hard you push. And I'm asking that in terms of what voters expect, right? Because voters are seeing delay. They're seeing bills taking really a long time to get through.
What's an example?
Oh, well, the housing bill, for example,
It's 2 months.
took a long time.
2 months delay. 2 months during which there were extra negotiations. Like and I think, again, this is what I mean. Like, Labor talks this up because Labor seems to think that their band-aid agenda is enough. Like, Labor's what have we got? What have we got at the moment?
You don't think voters see the headlines and feel like, because they see those talking points from Labor, do you think they see that and think the Greens are stopping us, stopping the government's agenda, they're stopping things getting done?
I think people want outcomes. I think people, one of the points we've been trying to make to the government is that this Parliament could have been an opportunity for some real progressive reform. There was capacity in the Senate to tackle some of the big problems that the country is facing. We could have had during this Parliament some reform on these billions of dollars of tax handouts that are going to wealthy property investors. There probably would have been numbers there in the Senate to pass that. There would have bbeen capacity in this Parliament to start making the big corporations pay tax. We could have got that through the Senate. And instead, Labor, it's a band-aid approach. It's a band-aid approach to the housing crisis. On climate, they say they're acting, but then they're opening, they approve 30 plus new coal and gas projects. So I think people see that the government is not doing enough. I think people are at the point now where they understand, can't keep voting for the same 2 parties and expecting a different result. And the feedback that I get, when we say, look, here's what we managed to achieve, extra $3.5 billion for public and community housing, I think people that I speak to are grateful that there's more coming for public and community housing, for example.
So I guess what I'm asking is, do you think some of that nuance is lost on voters? Do you think voters might punish you?
Well, look, we just had WA election where we've gone from 1 seat to 4, and there were big swings to the Greens in the WA election. And we now have a record number of Greens MPs across the country in federal and state parliaments. And I think people can see that we are offering something genuinely different. People understand, can't keep voting for the same 2 parties and expecting a different result. We're getting good feedback about our policy platform that we're taking to this election. We've spent a year outlining a very strong social democratic policy platform, in large part because it is what is going to, overwhelmingly because it is what is going to help people now, but also it's not just the right thing to do to make Australia more equal and make the big corporations pay their fair share of tax. But as you look around the rest of the world, you look at people like Trump get a foothold when governments fail to act and look after people. And this is part of what we've been trying to point out to the government during the course of this term, is that in the middle of a housing and rental crisis, if we don't act to make people's lives better, then the likes of Dutton and Trump come along and they blame migrants, or they use that dislocation and disconnection to try and whip up fear for their hard right agenda. And It's government's failure to act to look after people that often creates the conditions for that.
So we've talked a couple of questions now about like what the last or this current parliament's like. To go to the next parliament, I mean, obviously we don't know what the makeup of the House or the Senate will be. But, you know, obviously we talked about in this term of Parliament, you didn't get everything you wanted, but Labor did meet you halfway on a couple of things, or they eventually seemed to, you know, take inspiration from some things that you called for and did a similar version of their own. Depending the numbers in the both houses, is that what you would expect would happen in this term of Parliament, the coming term of Parliament after this election?
Look, in the coming term, if you look back to the 2010 Parliament that I was in, during those discussions at the start of the formation of Parliament, we negotiated getting a price on pollution, dental reform on dental. We ended up getting dental into Medicare for kids. And $13 billion in clean and renewable energy came out of that. And then during the course of the Parliament, we were able to achieve some more reforms as well. Greater protection for workers who contract cancer, for example, and a number of other measures. What we're putting on the table and the priority areas that we've outlined, make big corporations pay tax, get dental into Medicare, move towards free childcare, ending native forest logging, all of those areas that we've outlined are all things that I think are very popular with people, would be very, very popular with people. And so what I would hope, and what I think history shows, is that in this coming Parliament, where they're going to have to talk to, they're going to have to respect the Parliament that the Australian people choose, there is a real opportunity to get some really good things done.
What if it's Peter Dutton in government? I mean, in minority or majority? Again, like we don't. This is hypothetical, built on hypothetical here. But you know, there is still a chance that either party might end up in minority government. We don't know what's the next couple of weeks will look like. If it was Peter Dutton in, say, minority government, you'd be sidelined to an extent, wouldn't you?
Well, our priority is to keep Peter Dutton out, and the
But
one thing that we've made
it
crystal clear is that we
happen.
won't support him. And we'll be spending our time during the course of this remaining election campaign working hard to keep Peter Dutton out. I think we saw during the course of the previous coalition governments, I think people ended up understanding that in many respects the Greens were the real opposition to the coalition. And we have a strong presence in the Senate, and we've been instrumental in stopping a lot of the harm that the coalition has intended to cause. Of course, when Labor and the coalition do their deals together, as they very often do, then of course legislation can get through. We understand that, but a strong Greens presence in the next Parliament, firstly, is going to help keep Peter Dutton out, but secondly, previous coalition governments show that a strong Greens presence is good insurance.
So you would rule out working with Peter Dutton. There's nothing you would think about working with him on.
We wouldn't support him to become Prime Minister. No, that's crystal clear. Again, look back at previous parliaments after getting world-leading reform on climate that actually saw Australia's pollution starting to come down for the first time in peacetime history. That is what is important. We achieved that. The coalition and Rupert Murdoch set about undoing it straight away. And so we know that he will tear down the things that are important to us, and that's why he needs to be kept as far away from the lodge as possible.
I feel like I have to ask you, in the interest of balance, whether you get along with Peter Dutton personally, whether you talk to him at all.
No, not really. I don't have that much to do with him at all.
No cups of tea between the two of you.
Correct.
The next question I wanted to ask you about in relation to Israel and the Gaza conflict. I want to put something to you that the major parties and your critics often say. Are the Greens an anti-Semitic party?
No, absolutely not. And we, right back at the beginning, from the first day, from October 7, we made our position really, really clear, which was not only to condemn the attacks and the taking of hostages, but to say that the invasion of Gaza could not take place. And we said very clearly in those debates back at the time, our position was clear: no to anti-Semitism, no to Islamophobia, no to the invasion. And we were the only party in Parliament that voted against the motion supporting the invasion. of Gaza, and we made the point at the time, if you sanction an invasion of an area half the size of Canberra with 2.2 million people walled in, 40% of them under 15 and nowhere to go, it will be a slaughter. And we now have Amnesty International saying that there's a genocide taking place. We have international courts putting Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu under arrest warrants. He's an extremist Prime Minister of the likes of Trump. And when other extremist governments take action, then Australia not only condemns it, but takes steps, like puts sanctions on, for example, as with the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. And what we've been saying for the last year and a half is that you cannot continue to allow extremist leaders like Benjamin Netanyahu to ignore international law and continue to cross red lines. And so it's something for us that it's a principle grounded in humanity, grounded in international law. And it gives me no pleasure to note that, like, over the last year, the things that we were predicting have come true, and increasingly you now have United Nations, Amnesty International, international courts and bodies all coming around to the position that we said at the time.
You talked about sanctions there, and my colleague Dan Jarvis-Barty has written a couple of stories in this regard, saying that there is some sort of grassroots push on in Labor for, after the election, if Labor gets back in, to re-examine, maybe not sanctions, but some sort of stronger language on this issue for the Australian government to take more action or to be more involved. In a minority parliament, would that be something the Greens would push for stronger action on, to push the government more in that direction?
Well, look, there's a number of things the government could do. The government could end the two-way military trade. The government could recognise Palestine. Government could put sanctions on the ministers and the government of the extremist Netanyahu government and war cabinet. Australia could join in some of the international proceedings, including those that South Africa are bringing. There's a number of really practical things that Australia could do to join that majority of the world that's acting. Now, we're going to keep pushing for that regardless of what kind of parliament it is, because it's the right thing to do. And as you note, I do think there is growing support, especially as we see the ceasefire being ended again, and the invasion of Gaza happening again. I do think there is growing support for saying, look, the killing has to stop, including from people across the political spectrum, but including, as you say, within the other parties.
We've seen real social division over the Israel-Gaza war. I don't remember ever seeing this kind of disagreement between communities and such deeply felt upset in my time in this country. And we know that Peter Dutton and the Liberals have been very clearly pro-Israel. We know the government has kind of tried to cover both sides. They've got to maintain that social cohesion. What about the Greens? What is your idea of how you bring that social cohesion back amongst different communities who often aren't talking to each other?
When I say with respect, I don't agree with that characterisation of the government. I think that's a very pro-government characterisation. Like, they took a side. They took a side at the beginning, and they said, we want Parliament to pass a motion to say that the looming invasion is okay. And Labor worked with Liberals to get that through the Parliament. Like, Labor has adopted a very clear position of saying that they will not call for a unilateral ceasefire, that they will not take any steps to put pressure on when international law is being breached. So I think
there is still a rupture in this country.
And so
how do you heal
But
that?
that's why we've said very clearly from the beginning, and what we've called for to answer this question about what we need to do in this country, because it's an important question. We want to see a fully funded anti-racism strategy that tackles all forms of racism, that begins at the school level, that has educational components to it, that starts to stamp out racism in all its forms. And we've also, for a long time, been the ones calling out the really worrying rise of the far right in Australia, something that our security agencies in the last parliament were saying was a real concern and one of the biggest threats, because that is, like, we have seen like virulent anti-Semitism from the far right in Australia, and we have been consistently calling that out. So I think there's a real need in this country for a grassroots, ground-up anti-racism strategy to begin and to be fully funded. The Human Rights Commission has laid out a roadmap for us about what it would look like. Like, let's get on and implement that and fully fund that.
Adam, could I switch gears back to policy again now? You talked about gas earlier. What did you make of Peter Dutton's gas analysis, the report that he put out yesterday, the policy that was announced in the budget reply? What do you make of that?
Well, I think it's premised on a pretty astounding admission, actually. An astounding admission that there isn't a gas shortage in this country, which is something that a number of people have been saying for a while. Australia is awash with the stuff. Australia is awash with gas. Most of it gets sent overseas. 80% of it gets sent overseas. And so underpinning the recognition, like this finally belated recognition from Peter Dutton, is that there's actually plenty of gas in Australia to allow us to make the transition to renewables. As in, there's it is there. Australia is awash with the stuff. But the next step of his plan is wrong, because what he then says is we need to open up more coal and gas mines, which is not right. And I think in exactly the same way that his nuclear policy is a cover for expanding coal and gas and keeping it in the system for longer, so his new gas policy is just a fig leaf for fast-tracking the opening of new climate-destroying gas mines. There's a really simple thing that could be done. Stop big corporations like Santos plundering the domestic market to fulfill their overseas contracts, because that's what they're doing. They're going into the domestic market, they're taking out gas, and then they're sending it overseas. If you stopped them doing that, this year you would free up about 22 petajoules of gas. Over the next decade, that rises to over 200 petajoules, which is about half of what manufacturing needs. And you can do that without opening up new coal and gas mines.
Gas policy is enough to make my head explode. It is so complicated, and I feel like if we're having trouble getting across it, I pity the voter. But I want to ask a little bit about the transition to renewables. Do we just have to accept that our power bills are going to be high because we're rebuilding the grid, right? We're transitioning. So all this talk about, we can get your power bills down, is all of that just a distraction from the reality that we're going to have to pay more?
No, I don't think it is. There's obviously going to have to be some more investment in transmission so that we can greater connect up the grid across the country. That would have had to happen anyway. And the question is, what's the best kind of investment to do it? And the energy modelers and the experts all say this, we're going to have to invest a lot in the grid anyway, no matter what we do. So the question is, what kind of investment do we want to do? But no, there's some really practical things that could be done to reduce pressure on the grid and to reduce people's power bills. Support for batteries, for example. We just announced today our plan for renters to have a right to put solar on their properties, where the government steps in and help meet some of the upfront cost and then recovers it from the landlord when they sell the property next time around. So there's lots of things that can be done now that will actually reduce power bills, right? Reduce power bills. I think we need a shift in mentality to a surplus mentality of electricity and stop seeing it as an opportunity for big corporations to make a profit and start seeing it as something that we produce in the public interest and pass on to households and businesses at as next to cost price as possible. We have got so much sun and wind in this country. It's the envy of other places around the world. We could be the country that you decide to bring and establish your energy-intensive business in the region because we offer cheap, clean electricity. There's a real opportunity here for us. So I think given how much sun and wind we've actually got the prospect of driving electricity down even further. Be much better done if there was greater public ownership of it and it wasn't being done as a profit-making venture by big corporations. And if we gave people the assistance they need to do practical things like get batteries in. And then that way I think we can actually drive down cost.
And I feel like we have to ask you about podcasts because you're on a podcast.
Oh, yeah, okay. Great. Excellent.
And we are seeing more and more politicians go on influencer podcasts.
Yeah.
So they're kind of avoiding the tough journalist questions. They're talking to the Abby Chatfields, people who might agree with them. I mean, do you think we are in danger of politicians becoming more siloed? They're just going to talk to the people who agree with them, and the voters aren't going to hear views that they might disagree with. And that's, you talk about US style politics. That's kind of where a lot of that stuff started in the US. The Fox News, the Tea Party, they all became really resistant. They wouldn't compromise, and they just spoke to people who agreed with them. And so there wasn't that unifying conversation.
Sounds a bit like Peter Dutton and 2GB. I think we can walk and chew gum at the same time, and I think the rise of new media is meeting a real need from people, like in very much the same way that this podcast is doing now, of actually being able to hear an idea beyond a soundbite, and to actually kick an idea around, discuss it, and test it in a longer format. And I think that is something like that is what people are getting out of a lot of the new media and some of those that you referred to. And I certainly haven't been, restricting what have been going on. Like we held a press conference this morning, doing this afternoon, off to talk to some other people from new media after this. Like, I think you've got to do all of the above, but I think it meets a need. And it's I think it's actually a good need that is there, and it's something that we should take a bit of hope in that. What I hear back from people is we want to hear a bit more detail about the issue. Like take one example is preferential voting, for example. Like, there has been a lot of people that I've spoken to come and said, can you tell me how the voting system works? I don't understand how the voting system works. Now, that is quite different to 10, 15 years ago. There's a real desire and hunger for people to actually have the facts and have the information, and they're getting it through a lot of new media. And I actually think that's really great. That is great. And there's a desire for information that people feel, and in many instances rightly, isn't being met from traditional media. I guess it depends which traditional media you listen to, but a lot of people are saying, well, if I go and listen to this podcast or follow this person's show, I'm going to work out how preferential voting works and understand that we don't have a two-party system here in Australia, or I'm going to find out a bit more about the policy around renters. And I think that hunger, desire for information from trusted sources is a good thing.
This might be our last one, and I want to play devil's advocate to Reged's question, and my question is sort of on the other side of the coin to that. Yeah, we'll talk about Abby Chatfield. She came to your event in Melbourne where you DJ'd. I quite liked the videos of you up there. It was
fun. It was good.
Nightcat in Melbourne. And the reason we bring her up is because I think sort of surprisingly, but not sort of a bit unsurprisingly too, has become like a bit of a central figure in this election. She's interviewed Albanese, and she's got Jackie Lambie on as well. But she has copped some heat recently from the Liberals over some of her social media posts, with interviews with you and the PM as well. Are people overreacting to this trend, do you think?
Oh, well, look, I think the thing about the Liberals' response to that, I remember Peter Dutton going on a long podcast as well. Like, I think it's purely partisan.
True.
It's just purely partisan from the Liberals, and they're terrified. And like, I think the Liberals understand that, we in a housing and rental crisis, in a climate crisis, they look at what the Liberal Party has to offer, and they don't like it. And so what's the Liberals' response? Well, the Liberals' response is to go and blame the messenger. It's like, no, maybe people are turning off you because you're trying to bring Trump-style politics to Australia, who's trying to cook our future.
Adam Bandt, thank you so much for coming in today. It sounds like, given you're doing podcasts and traditional media, you're going to be super busy in this campaign. So best wishes to you as you continue up to the federal election.
Yeah, thank you.